Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about how the 13 British colonies became the United States of America. After the French and Indian War, Britain was left heavily in debt. To pay back the war debt, Britain began taxing the colonists. The colonists were upset with the taxes because they were not represented in Parliament and had no say in the taxation policies. It's important to understand that it was a long road that the colonists traveled down before arriving at declaring independence from Britain and starting a revolution. It started with boycotts, petitions, and protests before moving into rebellion and eventually revolution. Let's start with the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was a tax on sugar. Although some of the colonists actually were able to buy sugar for cheaper, they were upset because they were being taxed without representation in Parliament. They chanted, "No taxation without representation." This meant that the colonists were being taxed, but didn't have a say in it. In response to the Sugar Act, the colonists began boycotting British goods. Boycott meant that the colonists refused to buy products like clothing and other manufactured goods from Britain. Instead, groups like the Daughters of Liberty made their own products. Once Britain realized that the Sugar Act wasn't being received kindly, they repealed the Sugar Act and created the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a tax on all paper products like stamps, legal documents, and playing cards. Yet again, the colonists rallied around the battle cry of no taxation without representation. This time, however, the colonists petitioned the king asking for political change. Specifically, they asked to either be represented in Parliament or have the taxes repealed. Well, the king listened, kinda. The British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but created the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts were import taxes on products like lead, paint, and glass. Import means bringing something into the country. In response, the colonists began protesting the taxes. Normally, we think of a protest as people gathered together with signs in hand and demanding that something be changed. There are other forms of protests, like petitioning and boycotting. As tensions flared between King George III and British colonists, a series of liberty violations began occurring. For example, the Quartering Act gave British soldiers the authority to sleep in the colonist homes without their permission. Can you imagine that? Coming home from school and there be American soldiers sleeping in your bed? That was a violation of the colonists' liberties. In response, the colonists began harassing the British soldiers. In one particular instance, the colonists escalated the verbal harassment into physical harassment. They began throwing hard snowballs and rocks at the British troops. Eventually, the soldiers and troops were locked into a standoff. The British soldiers ended up shooting and killing 5 British colonists. This event is known as the Boston Massacre. Still heading down the road, the British Parliament enacted the Tea Act, which gave a British company, the East India Tea Company, a monopoly on tea. This prohibited many colonists from selling tea to help support their families. In response, a group of colonists called the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans, boarded British ships in the Boston Harbor, and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the harbor, which was worth millions of dollars in today's money. King George III was outraged. He closed the Boston Harbor, dissolved the colonial legislatures, and suspended trial by jury. The colonists referred to this as the Intolerable Acts. It was during this time that Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. In it, he declared that it was common sense to declare independence. As we know, Americans declared independence and won the American Revolution, and that's how the United States of America was formed. To summarize, the key points of this lesson are that Britain enacted a series of taxes and created other ways to violate the colonists' liberties, like the Quartering Act, which led to the Declaration of Independence. Also, remember, the colonists were upset about the taxes because they claimed they were being taxed without representation. Thanks, everyone.